Thanks ever so much, everyone. And it was great to sort of see some of those inspirational things that are going on in terms of building with nature. So my day job is working for Polypipe Civils as the Green Urbanisation Manager, as well as working with the University of Exeter, where I'm focused on looking at people's adoption of new technologies in the construction sector, particularly to support nature. So how are we leveraging the new innovations in terms of IoT and sensor technologies to start delivering on these really important parameters, such as building with nature, that was spoken about in the last presentation. And I think we hear a lot of emphasis on things around the smart city, and we also hear a lot of buzzwords around what is smart, and also from an urban design context, how can the digital help us design the physical? And I think sometimes there's still a little bit of a disjunct between the two in terms of practice, because we don't always talk to people across those multiple disciplines, which is something we're really passionate about. And I mean, at Polypipe, we've been going for 25 years, and it's been really interesting to kind of have the work hat on and sort of look at these projects that I'll talk about in a little bit more detail in a second, and then sort of look academically at how we can really reevaluate how people are actually shepherding new innovations through construction projects. So this is just a few examples, and we're going to take you from Plymouth to around Greater Manchester just for a little while, because this is where we've done a lot of our pilot innovations. And we've worked with the urban design teams at Greater Manchester Authority, we've worked with the University of Salford, and what's really interesting about in Manchester is their digital policy making is actually hand in glove with their nature-based approach. So what's really interesting is it's an ecosystem where they want to see as many innovations implemented in that project life cycle to really see if they're delivering on water management and green infrastructure on new developments. So we had to come up with some really interesting ideas working with our friends at the Environmental Protection Group to think about how we could incorporate sensors and technology to measure how much water was being stored between nature-based solutions. Could we move water between them? Could we link this to weather data? And from an urban design context, this starts to become really interesting, because you can then actually at a master plan level look at the impact of new developments in the round and actually use that data to say, you know, are we managing the water the way we thought we were? Are those green assets performing in the way that we aspired to at the beginning? And I mean, some of those wonderful examples in the previous slides about how you created green streets and links to the Tamar, you know, from a master plan perspective, you can really start to then dig down into the data. And in reality, you know, we're delivering these kind of sensor technologies beneath not just green-blue roofs and tree pits, but in a lot of projects we're doing in Europe, they're under sports pitches and local authority-owned assets. So actually, when we onboard these, it becomes a really interesting conversation between private sector and public sector stakeholders to see how the assets are performing, because water and green infrastructure don't know those boundaries as they start to develop. So when we start digging into the data, it gives us some really important parameters. We've started putting sensor-based technology into community rain garden schemes as well, because particularly, you know, in some of these dense urban environments, we found a couple of projects also around the north of England in Mansfield. A lot of the residents were previously, before we started to actually explain what the value of these solutions were, applying for drop curves so the rain gardens couldn't be implemented in front of their homes. But when we started to actually do some community engagement and actually say, look, what we're doing underneath these assets, the engineering beneath them is actually delivering X number of litres, it's having this impact on your CSOs, your rivers will be cleaner, you're actually doing your bit for the environment. Without the data, you don't really have that evidence base to improve that. So I think it's really important as a tool for conversation. And I know that sometimes there's a lot of emphasis on the fact that data can be a bit technocratic and who owns the data, but when we start to actually sort of bridge those gaps, it can be really important and interesting. And one of the things we started doing in the Netherlands with the team over there is developing actually a tool called RainUp, which was really interesting because tech is expensive. So for about 3 years we started to think, well, actually, how can we get the price of these sensor technologies away from sort of big vanity projects and on big buildings in the centre of London? These were where all the pilots were. How can we take this down to the domestic level, put them in front gardens, get them into the kind of projects where citizens can actually upload their data and start working with the council after these master plan projects have been delivered? So we came up with a solution called Rain Up, and it was a very easy, cost-effective tool that we'll be launching here in the UK next year. And the data that came back was really, really insightful about sort of how we moved citizens along the adoption curve. So when they were given these kits to put into their front gardens, and when they could actually see how the technology was working, it was really interesting to see how the next phases of the developments that were being done on the outskirts of Amsterdam, they were actually applying for these to go in, and they were really interested to see how water neutral they could make their places and spaces. So, you know, on one hand, the complexity has to be explained at the beginning. You have to really take people on that journey. But from a design perspective, it's really good to be able to foster those types of communication. And one of the really interesting pilots we've done in the UK that I just want to highlight is this one in Greater Manchester called the Block Roof. And what we find is that water is often an overlooked element of urban design when we work with a lot of colleagues. And I mean, it's a really great opportunity today to have these kinds of discussions. And I know that in the previous talk, there was a lot of emphasis on how water would be used. But we often find that water and nature-based solutions become decoupled. And what's really useful from integrating these sensor technologies is that we can actually get the utilities companies on board as well at the very early stages. And you might think, well, what have utilities companies really got to do with urban design? You know, what do they have to say to it? But actually, you can unlock an awful lot of funding for schemes in city centres if you can demonstrate that what you're trying to achieve is actually going to have a real positive impact on the combined sewer overflows. And some of the work I've been doing at the University of Exeter, it's really interesting when you ask people what they think the most value that will come from implementing or smartifying nature-based solutions. The top is water and the second is biodiversity. So I think what's really interesting now is that whereas maybe 2 or 3 years ago people really saw the biodiversity benefits as top, that's really now water is at the height of that agenda with what we're seeing in the media, the problems people are seeing, and they're not trusting the water companies to manage it for themselves, so they really want these insights as well. So what we did on the block in Manchester, which is owned by a really forward-thinking company called Bruntwood Works, is we implemented what we call a polysync system. So the roof actually listens to the weather data. So if there's going to be a storm, the roof will actually only discharge as much water into the next treatment train as the storm is coming in, so it doesn't actually run empty to empty. So this transforms the way we design green-blue roofs, it transforms the way we design nature-based solutions, because from an engineering perspective, what we usually do is want to run the tanks empty to empty, which has a huge impact on the way we design any of our water management from roof to road. So this is a really sort of a step change in how we would usually implement these kind of rooftop solutions. And I also think from an urban design context, roofs are sometimes sort of a difficult, sometimes an opportunity area that we can't always exploit. And it's really interesting to sometimes bring them back into the conversation and make them more multifunctional, because there's often a sort of untapped opportunity. And one of the things that we don't always bring in the design process that we did here was to start thinking about passive irrigation, because we're actually designing for climate change now. And to be able to subsurface irrigate, hold water back beneath the assets, actually be able to use technology to manage water in a way that is going to even out the summer-winter extremes is really valuable from an urban design perspective, because it's lovely when you see the first vision images, isn't it? You know, you have fabulous sketches of what a community is going to look like. It looks brilliant. You've got all the lovely green trees, and we saw rain gardens in the previous discussions. But what I also see on Facebook are people very cross about rain gardens, when rain gardens die in the middle of towns and cities, because they're parched, they've gone in, best will in the world, but they look flipping awful in the summer, and they die back, and people just think they look a mess. And when people think they look a mess, they blame whoever put them in. And adoption to me is the critical hurdle. So sort of the work that we're doing at Exeter is trying to sort of look at previous, I suppose, academic literature that sort of tries to look at why people adopt something. And in terms of the sort of construction sector, you know, as urban designers, you set that fabulous vision. But of course that then goes through your contractors, your subcontractors, the people that have to build your vision. And when you're trying to implement new innovation, there are so many things that actually relate to people's intention to adopt something different and something new and innovative. So we're really looking at sort of not just people's personal preference, but from an organisational perspective, what really gets clients to take that leap? Because a lot of the time we are relying on private sector goodwill to do these things that you guys are all designing and doing a fabulous job of doing so. But there has to be the support, there has to be the adoption of that innovation. And that's the sort of work that we're really focused on now. And there's a huge gap in the sort of research at the moment that we're trying to fill, looking at when we actually integrate technology with nature, what impact does that have, sort of increasing the complexity of that approach? Because we all know SUDs was difficult 10 years ago. You know, just getting people to think about sustainable urban drainage was a huge conceptual leap. But now we've got all these other complexities in the mix. That's become a really interesting part of what we do. So sort of how can this become normalised, you know, for urban designers? Hopefully in the next 5-10 years, all these new innovations will be part of a toolbox that will be more readily accepted, and it'll be much more simple for people to manage and monitor their nature-based assets and plug them into other sort of smart cities objectives that we're seeing now. We're also doing a really interesting master plan on Stockport 8, and this is going to have multiple smart tanks all linked together. So United Utilities are really driving this with Greater Manchester, and this is the sort of final slide that I'll show you. And we're going to have over 1,000 new homes here. And what's really interesting about this is that we're actually linking a lot of the data coming in from United Utilities, a lot of the work with Greater Manchester Combined Authority, looking at air quality, looking at urban heat island effects. They're really focused on the additional metrics that nature can provide. But for United Utilities to actually provide additional funding to really ramp up the investment, they want to see just how much water they can keep out of the combined sewer. They want to see what water quality data can come out of it. So actually it's a really interesting opportunity for us to hold water back on green-blue roofs, manage it through tree pits and rain gardens, but actually link that to smart tanks and attenuation tanks below the ground, and actually then have sensors in the sewer network to tell us what that Stockport 8 project has actually delivered in terms of those parameters. So from an urban design perspective, that becomes really interesting because that site is becoming a measured asset that's actually delivering really long term. So you're seeing the rewards of that design in action. And of course, we talk about connectivity, but bringing these assets online also helps us to connect and plan and see where those green assets are going to be most effectively implemented. So we kind of map out both the digital and the physical element at the beginning. And this has been a really interesting journey in terms of this sort of multiple connections that we're creating. So I'll leave you with that, but I just wanted to sort of introduce you to some of these ideas and these concepts that we're looking at. And as I just say in point of conclusion, you know, moving people along the adoption curve, I think that's one of the real critical takeaways from the work we're doing is stakeholder engagement, not just private sector, not just local authorities, but actually the end users, and using that data for that positive good rather than sort of hoarding it at sort of client level, using that to democratise the assets that we're implementing. So thank you very much.
Thank you.